Here in part 3, let's explore crossing the Darwinian threshold. The Darwinian threshold, as we had just learned, is a term to describe a transition period during the evolution of the first cells when genetic information goes from being predominantly transferred in a horizontal mode to a vertical mode. The horizontal gene transfer is the movement of genetic and material and information other than by the vertical transmission of genes from parents to offspring. So vertical implies parent to offspring transmission. The Darwinian threshold concept has two predictions. First, that cellular life might have arisen more than once, perhaps accounting for the three domains, and others might have evolved as well, but that are now gone. It also allows that primitive life forms may have operated very differently than they are today, and that might not be detectable using our current molecular toolkits of ribosomal RNA and PCR reactions. Clicker question. The genetic flow of information is the same in all organisms. Okay? Which came first, DNA, RNA, or protein? In terms of recording information, the answer is RNA. Here you see that RNA can serve as an intermediate between and perform the same functions as DNA and as proteins. We have the observation that information flows from DNA to RNA to protein. The RNA can serve the information capacity, and it can also act as an enzyme. But it's more efficient to do it with DNA to RNA to protein because of a few obvious reasons. But first, let's ask a clicker question. Which statement is true? Ribosomal RNA is found only in primitive organisms. DNA was the first molecule on Earth. RNA can store genetic information as well as catalyze enzymatic reactions. Or D, the only way to learn about ancient life is to study fossils. Well, we do know that studying modern organisms can provide clues to the origins of life on Earth, and then in this case, the correct answer is C. RNA can serve to store genetic information, and it can also catalyze enzymatic reactions. The Darwinian threshold is a relatively easy concept to understand. If we think about the original life as being precellular on the surface of a vent wall or a clay particle, where information was exchanged in a horizontal fashion. The Darwinian threshold was crossed as soon as the horizontal gene transfer became isolated because of the presence of a membrane, so that all these reactions were now enclosed in a membrane. After that time, we believe that there was a vertical gene transfer, a transfer of information from parent to offspring, leading to speciation. We know that the processes that we thought might have taken place in early life are common to bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. It might have arisen several times, or there might have been a common ancestor to the group. LUCA is a term that's used to define the last universal common ancestor. Clicker question. The Darwinian hypothesis proposes that life was never communal but was always selfish, proposes that evolutionary changes transition from primarily horizontal to vertical gene transfer, or proposes that evolutionary changes transition from primarily vertical genetic to horizontal. The answer is B. proposes that evolutionary changes transitioned from the primarily horizontal to primarily vertical gene transfer. Okay, you can take a break if you'd like, but I'm going to continue. So let's return to the tree of life, which is what was introduced with the concept of trees in lecture 7. And the asterisks here represent points at which the Darwinian threshold was crossed. So since the time in which we had horizontal transfer and the emergence of membranes, we've seen the emergence of lineages, of archaea, of bacteria, and of eukarya. We'll talk more about the differences between archaea, bacteria, and eukarya in future lectures. It's important to note that all family trees are a hypothesis. They are a hypothesis to best explain the patterns we see based on the data that are available today, and that trees can change as we get more understanding. It is thought that there was a transition from the RNA world to the DNA world. There are several reasons to believe that RNA is probably not the best mode to store information and for protein synthesis. First piece of evidence is that RNA viruses have very high rates of sequence evolution. That is, that they mutate frequently. Second is that double-stranded DNA, which most cellular life forms use, is more stable because it can be replicated with a proofreading function. So RNA has high rates of mutation during replication, and it's prone to degradation. Double-stranded DNA overcomes this. So life forms which ended up using DNA, a double-strand DNA, would be able to retain information and pass it on to the next generation with a higher degree of sequence fidelity. When we look at this family tree and try to explain the patterns, we see some features that are common to all of the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. That is, at first they use DNA and RNA as the genetic material and for genetic expression. We use the same gene sequences to identify the amino acids that are used to build proteins. So we use the same code. Each of these forms of life uses lipid molecules as a mechanism to form a cell wall. And it turns out, as we'll see in a future lecture, that there are common central metabolic pathways that are in common among archaea, bacteria, and in eukarya. Each of these provides strong evidence that all of life is descended from a single common ancestor that we call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor.